So we're going to talk a little bit about the bedtime fading technique. It is used by a lot of sleep doctors, and it's actually very well researched. You'll see a lot of it in the sleep science research. And very simply, it's just a very late bedtime. We put the child to bed when they're much more tired, when the sleep pressure is greater, so that they can associate their bedtime routine with the feeling of falling asleep easier. And once we have that association, then we start to move the bedtime earlier to prevent overtiredness. Down the road, putting your child to bed before they're overtired will actually help them fall asleep easier and stay asleep and not have those early rising or fragmented sleep cycles in the middle of the night. But in the short term, bedtime fading can be really helpful. It's not great as a technique on its own. I know a lot of sleep doctors, they say they do it, but they're really combining it with cry it out. So I want to just suggest that when we're using bedtime fading, we also need to combine it with a technique where you're going to help your child learn sleep skills instead of just putting them down and letting them cry until they are completely exhausted and they fall asleep. So not every family needs to use the bedtime fading technique. It's really commonly used with older children, and so we don't use it so much with babies, although I have been using it quite a bit in my practice with babies, especially if you're worried about crying or your child's really taking a long time to fall asleep. It doesn't always happen when we have a really supportive strategy, but if you're concerned about it, you might try adding bedtime fading, and you might even just try for the first night and then go back to a reasonable bedtime. Now, if you look at the evening sleepy zones chart, you'll notice that there's some tired signs that happen, and then children enter what is known in research as the wake maintenance zone. And this is really the overtired zone. And once your child enters that overtired zone, typically we see a burst of energy for about 40 to 60 minutes, about an hour, then a dip in energy where your child might fall asleep, then another burst of energy, and then a dip in energy, and sometimes there's a third one. So parents often call this the second wind, the third wind. Really, ultimately, we want to put your child down in the drift-off zone before they enter that overtired zone altogether. The overtiredness causes the body to release cortisol, and cortisol stimulates the release of adrenaline. So these things can stay in the body, and the cortisol can fragment sleep cycles through the night. The interesting thing is that cortisol and melatonin have a reciprocal arrangement. So when cortisol rises, melatonin goes down. Melatonin rises, cortisol goes down. However, cortisol is a bit of a bully, and it's going to be a stronger force. So it kind of bosses the melatonin around a little bit. But in any case, so ultimately, if we can get children to bed before they're overtired, then we're less likely to see night wakings and early rising. So bedtime fading can be a technique just temporarily to use it to just try to keep your child from actually having too much of a difficult time falling asleep initially when we start coaching. So they can then have that nice steps of the bedtime routine and associate it with falling asleep easier. With the bedtime fading, we typically start with a really late bedtime. So you really have two options. You can put your child to bed when they have been falling asleep. So if you've been trying for a bedtime around 7, but they never fall asleep until 8, you can either do 8 or you can do 1 hour later, 9. You can also look at it a few other ways. So if your child has a 2.5-hour wakeful window and they had after a long nap, and then last nap was 45 minutes or longer, instead of putting them to bed at the 2.5-hour mark, we might do 4.5 or 5.5. So really we're looking for the child to be really good and exhausted. Now a lot of times it makes bedtime tricky because we don't want to see your child being really tired and then start the bath or the beginning parts of the bedtime routine. So you can actually split the bedtime routine. So you can do all of the important stuff, all the business part of the bedtime first. So that might be your bath, pajamas, feed, And then save the last steps, which are more about association and feeling good and safe to sleep. Save those until right before you're going to put your child to bed. So that might mean that when they start to look a little tired, you get the bedtime routine done, and then you might notice that they perk up a bit. So we're going to wait until they look really good and tired, and then when you see that, just finish up those last steps of the bedtime routine. It should take 1 to 5 minutes. Just maybe it's the kisses, the prayers, the hugs, I love yous, and into bed and whatever the other sleep coaching plan you're doing, you'll do that. So you can split the bedtime routine just to make it easier initially, and then also once your child is falling asleep within 20 minutes, so you're going with the late bedtime, you're putting them down, you're coaching them to sleep. When they're falling asleep in 20 minutes or less, then you know the next night you can then move the bedtime earlier. You can do it in increments, so 15 or 30 minutes earlier every night. You can also, especially if your baby's probably under 10 months or so, you can actually just jump to that ideal bedtime, and you might find that it's perfectly fine. Something you can do that might help if you're worried that this is going to be really late. In the evening, when you think your child should be going to bed, you can actually start to dim the lights, and that will help your baby produce their own melatonin. So you may see that they actually start to feel sleepier a lot sooner than you expected, because now we're using the melatonin to help them feel sleepy. So the bedtime fading, it's not an absolute necessity. It's something you can add to any sleep coaching strategy. It may make the process easier and gentler, especially initially on the first night. And then we always want to go back to preventing overtiredness in the long term. Now, some parents will ask me, doesn't that mean if they're going to bed overtired that they may actually have more disturbed sleep through the night? And it's true that there's a trade-off there. So some children may wake up more in the night. The one thing that I've noticed, though, is for children who are already waking up a lot in the night or waking up early, usually it doesn't get worse. Their sleep is already fragmented, so you don't necessarily have anything to lose. Be sure to post a question in the Facebook group if you have any questions about it, and keep us posted on how things are going. All right.